Hi everyone, thanks for joining. I just wanted to go ahead and get it started, but we are going to take another minute to let other people continue to join. So stay patient and we'll get started in another minute. All right, looks like we've got a pretty good count of attendees now and slowing down. So I'll go ahead and get everything started. Thank you all again for joining. I'm Casey Holland, if you don't already know me. And we'll get to introductions in a little bit. So just to make sure everyone's in the right place, this is the DLC's Horticultural Lighting version 2.1 final policy release webinar. And for everyone who has been involved and is in the right place right now, I just want to go ahead and say thank you one more time for your input and expertise as we worked to develop this version 2.1 policy. It's a very tedious process and it's very time consuming. We rely a lot on industry experts and our stakeholders to make sure that our policies get to where they need to be to support the utility programs and other goals for accelerating LED adoption in controlled environment agriculture. So thank you all one last time for version 2.1. I'm sure it won't be the last time we're working together, and I look forward to some future conversations just like this one. So with that, I'll go ahead and move us forward into our agenda slide here. And as you can see, we're going to start off with some introductions to let you know who's speaking to you today, if you're not already familiar with us, and who's also on the back end here at the DLC side. We're going to go over some webinar logistics. We're also going to talk about the version 2.1 overview and timeline, and then get into the technical requirements and other requirements for the new product types that are supported by version 2.1, like DC powered fixtures, externally supplied actively cooled fixtures, LED replacement lamps, and then we're going to end with about a 15-minute or so Q&A session right at the end. Feel free to type in your questions at any point throughout the webinar, and either one of my colleagues or I will either type an answer back to you immediately, or we'll look to respond to your question that you've submitted at the end of the webinar. So thank you in advance, and let's go ahead and get this thing started. All right, so as you can see here, our presenters for today are going to be Axel Pearson. He is the Senior Technical Product Manager here at the DLC, mostly working on our SSL program, and local efforts, but he's also going to be covering the lamps requirements from version 2.1 and also facilitating the Q&A session at the end of the call. And you have myself. I'm the DLC's technical manager for the horticultural program, and I will be leading today's webinar, and I will also be covering the externally supplied actively cooled fixture requirements. Last but definitely not least here, for presenters, we've got Greg Barker, who provides us some technical support from Energy Solutions. He's the technical director there. And he is going to be covering the DC powered requirements that are going to be laid out today. He also helps us with a lot of other things here at the DLC, including the DC policy for our SSL program and a lot of other stuff. So we're very happy to have him and all his help throughout this development process. All three of us presenters will come on as we present our sections, but we're also going to be available at the end. So to answer any questions that you have during the Q&A session. So again, feel free to type them in now or wait until the end, and we'll try to do our best to make sure that everything gets answered. But got another slide talking a little bit more about the Q&A, so I'll save that for then. All right. Also, we've got Stuart Berjanski and Adrian Martin, who are the technical director and technical analyst here at the DLC, respectively. Both of these are going to be some DLC team members who are helping monitor the questions in chat pane and helping make sure that your questions get answered. So again, feel free to type them in as you see fit, or wait until the end, and Stuart and Adrian will do their best to make sure that they're all getting answered either live or at the end of the webinar during the Q&A session. All right, so for some webinar logistics, just to cover the basics, slides and recording of this webinar will be posted on the DLC website on our DLC news and events page. There's a link right here shortly after today's presentation. So it might be today or it might be within the next couple of days, but this will be provided online. So stay patient and it'll be there for you. Also, just as a note, all attendees are automatically muted. So we can't hear you right now, but you should have some other chat features to let us know if you are experiencing any technical issues. Feel free to reach out at any time. It's not just questions about the webinar that we can answer here. Just also another note about scope. Any questions that kind of come in that are outside of the version 2.1 scope will be answered outside of this webinar. All right, so now for the questions and answers piece. Like I mentioned, we do have 15 minutes allotted toward the end of the webinar to answer any of your questions. We have the two DLC teammates who are going to be providing technical support to answer your questions as they come in, or to make sure that they go to the right technical leads, like myself, Axel, or Greg, to make sure that your questions get answered. Some questions will be answered aloud, and some, if they're more appropriate, say for just a specific response, they'll be typed into chat directly back to you, or if it's appropriate for the entire audience to potentially know about that information, we'll go ahead and respond to the entire chat. So feel free to type in all your questions that you have, and we're going to do our best to make sure that we answer all of those for you. And thank you in advance. All right, now I'll go ahead and cover some of the 2.1 overview and timeline information, if you're not already familiar with it. As we mentioned in the Draft 1 and Draft 2 release webinars, I just want to clarify and reiterate that version 2.1 does not impact version 2.0 listings, and all it is intended to do is add eligibility pathways for new product types, like DC and modular or dynamically configurable products, or products with externally supplied, actively cooled capabilities, or certain LED lamp replacement products. And our goal with version 2.1 is by adding more product types, we hope that we will accelerate the industry's adoption of LEDs, essentially yielding greater energy savings and more efficient practices in controlled environment agriculture. How we think this works is because the lamps pathway, for example, lays out a nice transition for growers who are still using legacy sources and are interested in switching over to LEDs, but aren't ready to make the full switch to full fixtures. And then also the DC and actively cooled pathways we find really interesting, and we think these solutions really can help yield greater facility level efficiencies. And I'm just really excited about starting to see these types of products on the QPL, and also knowing that certain states like Massachusetts and Illinois have certain compliance pathways through the DLC QPL. We want to make sure that we're not essentially locking these product types out and are giving growers the best options. Sorry about that. I think I got muted on accident. All right. So again, just to reiterate, 2.0 will not be impacted by version 2.1. So no delisting to currently listed version 2.0 products. And 2.1 listed products will follow the same timeline as version 2.0 in terms of listing and delisting. So more information on that later. But again, the cover letter that was released with the final policy for version 2.1 describes the changes that occurred for the final policy from draft 2. And the focus of today's webinar is really going to be about the final technical requirements as proposed in the final policy. But there will be some emphasis on some changes here and there. Again, if you're curious about anything, feel free to write in the chat and we'll make sure we're answering your questions. All right, so as I just mentioned, these 2.1 lays out the new product type requirements, and in each requirement subsection, they're essentially considered special considerations for these product types, and each of those subsections follows a similar format where we lay out eligibility requirements, where we say, for example, define the product type, or say which types of those products are or aren't specifically eligible, and how we define those eligibility terms. Then we go into the technical requirements subsection. So this might be reporting or testing requirements, or how things need to be gathered, for example, during the application, and make sure that we can qualify your products. And then another section after that that details the QPL listed information that comes from the submission materials and review. And then you'll see that today's webinar essentially aims to follow the same kind of subsection layout where we'll be defining eligibility and then the technical requirements and then describing the QPL listed information. All right, and then the next slide should be the timeline. So here you can see we started this with the first draft release back in October. Now we're all the way in July, right after the final policy release. One more thank you for everyone for all of your expertise and input and letting us get to this final policy release and start to lay the groundwork for qualifying these types of products onto the horticultural QPL. And it's been a long time coming for some of these. So for example, the DC pathway was first proposed in version 1.2 policy almost 2 years ago and has been in the work ever since. And so thank you all for your patience. I know a lot of you have been dying to get on the QPL, and we're excited to finally start qualifying these types of products. And on that note, we do expect to start qualifying or start accepting applications to qualify these types of products September 1st. And essentially, we are working to build out that application process right now to make sure that once September 1st comes around, we can start accepting these applications and qualifying them as soon as possible on the QPL. More information specific to either manufacturer guidance or implementation specifics, like how you're going to submit a version 2.1 application or fee information, that'll be covered and released closer to the September 1st effective date. So thank you for your patience as we release that information. And now I will hand it over to my colleague Greg, who will describe the DC powered fixtures technical requirements. I am not hearing you, Greg.
Great. Well, let me get unmuted on my phone and hopefully everyone can hear me now. All right, moving on into DC powered fixtures. Thanks, Casey. Next slide. Um, we are talking about the same scope of DC powered horticultural fixtures that we've been discussing the last couple drafts of this policy before this final version. So here's a review of the two types we've defined. Uh, and the important distinction here is that the first category of fixtures are always marketed as intended for use with a power source. That's not always true for every fixture in the second category. They may or may not have a power source intended for use and marketed with them. Moving beyond eligibility into our testing requirements here over the next several slides. Slide, Casey. Um, we have kind of two key technical documents that differ from the standard AC Hort requirements. And these are the same two requirements we've been presenting since draft one, and only a few details of these have changed. But this is the photon flux test report and the power source test report. And we'll get into a little more detail here on the next slide for the first of these. So this is the fairly simple report of photon flux and power consumption with a DC powered input. So in evaluating DC powered products for qualification, it's important to remember this last bullet here, that the technical requirement for photosynthetic photon efficacy, that's PPE, needs to be met by the ACD rated PPE value, and not just the DC PPE value that's shown on this LM79 report. Next slide will show our power source test report. So here we see the information that we're trying to collect on the power source, the AC to DC power source. This is the sort of term we have settled on. Instead of AC to DC driver or power supply, we're kind of consolidating that into calling that a power source. So we've made a few changes here. We've eliminated the previous technical requirement for listing, bench testing of the power sources at 20% and 50% load. And we're just asking for 2 points instead of 3 now. So that's the maximum power load and the worst case efficiency between maximum power and 20% of maximum power. So you see we're getting away from gathering data on efficiency kind of across the load curve and really trying to focus on the maximum rated output point and then the worst case point. And hopefully this is a simplification, and it really does focus in a kind of worst case scenario, similar to other DLC ratings and technical requirements. Of course, that maximum power load is dependent on the actual number of fixtures that can be powered with a power source and fixture combination that's in question. So it's not necessarily the maximum rated load of the power source itself. And once again, that lowest worst case efficiency of all the input voltages available for that power source is the one that's going to be used to determine the ACD rating conversion efficiency that feeds into the input wattage and PPE listing. Okay, next slide, Casey. This is just a sample of what that power source test report looks like. And of course, as a DLC, we'll be covering some template help, but we'll talk more about the operational end of the application process and how DLC can provide a template closer to the date that this becomes an active policy this fall. Next, these are a couple of our reporting requirements. First, this is similar as in the last draft. We are asking manufacturers to provide a cabling scenario for a fully loaded power supply, one for each fixture. So this is just an example. The actual cabling is going to be determined by electricians and based on the sort of comprehensive site information. But what we found in talking to manufacturers was there were parameters in their typical setup that were worth providing as an example, series versus parallel wiring being the standard, the number of fixtures per cabling run, that kind of information is what we expect to see and are asking manufacturers for in that first example. The second is to call attention to language in the new version 2.1 that clarifies where the in situ temperature measurement test is required. Those reports are going to be looked for external power sources and for DC to DC power sources at the fixture level as well. They're commonly called DC to DC drivers as well. Okay, I have a last slide here on the listing information. These are similar fields, and a few of them have been renamed, but there are no major changes here from the last draft. The input power type distinguishes the DC power products from AC, and then we list the voltage and input current, wattage, and PPE values. The third to last, well, in the middle of this page, I'll say at least, in bullet-wise, there's a few bullets on the derating input power and derated PPE, where those are calculated based, again, on that conversion efficiency. It's either from the power source test report for all fixtures that provide that, or from a standard 87.5% conversion efficiency, where there's no power source marketed with the product. And that concludes my slides, so I'll hand it back to Casey, and thank you all.
All right, thanks, Greg. Hello again, everyone. I'll be talking about the externally supplied actively cooled fixture requirements now. So I'll go ahead and get started with that. So in terms of eligibility, version 2.1 lays the groundwork to include LED horticultural fixtures that employ externally supplied circulating liquid to actively cool the products. And we define these as essentially as which products in which a liquid, often water or water glycol solution, flows through input and output ports of each fixture in the system, being channeled through a cooling plate or other heat exchanger within the fixture. And then to clarify, externally supplied ducted forced aired products are not eligible at this time. And just in general, externally supplied actively cooled fixtures or externally supplied circulating liquid fixtures, just in general throughout the technical policy or this webinar, I'll just be calling them actively cooled fixtures. And as a reminder, just like Greg mentioned for the DC subsection, actively cooled fixtures here have a baseline of all version 2.0 horticultural lighting technical requirements as the baseline requirements. So this includes things like the power quality baselines, the PPE threshold, our warranty requirements, UL 8800 safety certification, TM33 reporting, etc. So all the version 2.0 technical requirements apply. And then the slides that we are addressing here and the special considerations in the technical requirements essentially lay out the requirements that either replace or complement the version 2.0 technical requirements baseline. All right, so some reporting requirements for these actively cooled fixtures. Manufacturers have to specify the allowable operating conditions that should be supplied to or affect the LED product performance, including the solution type and concentration, and restrictions or limitations to these solution types or concentrations must be described as part of the application process, either in the spec sheet or some kind of marketing materials, and that information will be reported on the QPL. Also, flow rate must be reported in gallons per minute. The inlet fluid temperature range that's allowed has to be defined and reported as part of the application process. So a minimum and a maximum inlet fluid temperature that's allowed for operation must be described. And additionally, a set of data that relates the input power and PPF as functions of the inlet fluid temperature must be reported, covering the full range it will have to be reported in 5-degree increments, 5 degrees Celsius increments or smaller. So say, for example, if you're between 25 and 50 as the allowable range, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, and 50 would have to be the data points for input power as a function of inlet fluid temperature, and as well as for ppf as a function of inlet fluid temperature. Additionally, some self-protect cutoff functionality as proposed in draft 2 is now a requirement. So the fail to off functionality must be present. Essentially, this functionality protects the fixture in the event that the externally powered actively cooled system fails. Since it's responsible for cooling the fixture, we want to make sure that the fixture is protected, since we are not considering the actively cooled system as part of our technical requirements itself. For some testing requirements, manufacturers' allowable operating conditions inform the threshold qualifying states to be tested. So knowing that there's a variety of products that allow a variety of inlet fluids, we do state and require that water is the solution used during LM79 and ISTMT testing. Is also using the operating conditions that are previously mentioned. The median inlet fluid temperature shall be used during LM79 testing. So for example, if you have this 20 to 50 degrees Celsius inlet fluid temperature operating range, then the median inlet fluid temperature would be 35 degrees Celsius in this case. And the average and maximum inlet fluid temperatures must be measured alongside the LM79 stabilization measurements and reported for qualification, as well as the outlet fluid temperatures. So essentially, if you're thinking about LM79, they have a stability requirements in terms of optical stability, and it requires 3 measurements. So whenever you're doing those LM79 stability measurements, make sure you're measuring the inlet fluid temperature and outlet fluid temperature so that you can report the average and maximum values that correlate to the LM79 stabilization measurements. Additionally, for ISTMT testing, the worst case inlet fluid temperature should be used. So in the example above, the worst case inlet fluid temperature would now be 50 degrees Celsius, and the average and maximum inlet fluid temps must be measured alongside the ISTMT stability measurements at this point. So I believe that 1598 defines ISTMT stability where you're testing every 15 minutes and you're getting 1 degree or smaller change, and it's not increasing. So these measurements would happen alongside those. So additionally, the average and maximum flow rates measured in gallons per minute must be measured and reported for both the LM79 and ISTMT testing. And just additionally, knowing that a lot of these or all of these criterion right here are required but are outside of the LM79 scope, we do expect that the LM79 test report or the photon flux test report would capture these in the report itself, and most likely, hopefully, in a separate section that clarifies that it's outside of the LM79 scope itself. All right, so for some more testing requirements, the manufacturer's allowable operating conditions do inform that threshold qualifying state that's tested, as I described on the previous slide, and here's some clarifications to those. So all of the inlet fluid temperatures that are targeted, either the median or the worst case, have to be maintained within a plus or minus 2.5 degree Celsius delta. So whether you're targeting the median for your LM79 test or the worst case for your ISTMT, make sure that those inlet fluid temperatures are staying within a plus or minus 2.5 degrees Celsius range. Also, all actively cooled horticultural fixtures seeking qualification by the DLC must test a fixture per ANSI IS LM79 while employing the active cooling system. So it can't be not being cooled while it's being tested. And then additionally, the DLC will accept LM79 test reports or photometric test reports with methods or equipment from other gonioradiometer types in addition to type C for actively cooled fixtures. And we do reserve the right to require additional information in these cases. All right, so now to get into the QPL listing information. So in addition to all of the current fields that already exist under version 2.0, actively cooled fixtures will have a bit more information showing up on the HortQPL. One of those will be acknowledging that there is an actively cooling, or sorry, an active cooling presence. So something like a filter or a filterable field on the HortQPL will designate these products as having an actively cooled presence. Additionally, the tested inlet fluid temperature and tested flow rate, maximums and averages per ISTMT and LM79 testing will be reported on the QPL. In addition to those, the tested outlet fluid temperature, maximum and averages from the LM79 test will be also reported on the QPL. And then lastly, in terms of reporting, the solution concentration restrictions that are required to be reported are going to be reported on the QPL externally. So not just for qualification, but for stakeholder information, as well as the minimum and maximum allowable inlet fluid temperatures, which are defined by the manufacturer's allowable range. That'll be reported in the QPL. The self-protect cutoff temperature will be reported on the QPL, as well as the data that depicts the PPF and input wattage as functions of the inlet fluid temperature. And with that, I will conclude the actively cooled section of this webinar here, and I will hand it over to Axel to describe the LED replacement lamp requirements.
Thanks, Casey. Hi, everyone. Axel here. And yes, I am also wearing my plaid shirt today. We didn't plan it, I promise. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to the next slide. I'll talk about LED replacement lamps. 2.1 adds eligibility for two categories of replacement lamps, the pin-based fluorescent replacement lamp and the MOGLED-based HID replacement lamp. So I'll talk through the requirements for each category separately over the next couple of slides. But before I do that, I want to cover some terminology and make sure that we are clear about our intended categories, because these lamps often go by many names. And so on the left side of the screen there, we have a picture of the typical pin-based fluorescent replacement lamp, also known as the linear replacement lamp, LED tube, TLED. The latter is what I will use today because it's short and easy, and I'm going to be saying it a lot. So whatever we mean when we're talking about LED lamps here that are intended to replace fluorescent T8 and T5 lamps that have a G13 and a G5 base respectively. Again, I'm calling them TLEDs today. Okay, on the right, we have the MOGLED-based lamps, also known as HID replacement lamps, corn cob lamps, or MOGLEDs. Again, I'm going to use that one today because it's short and easy to say. Again, whatever you want to call them, we are referring to the LED lamps that are intended to replace the single-ended, high-intensity discharge lamps that have a screw base of E39 or E40 base. So those are the larger screw base. Okay, Casey, next slide, please. All right, now that we're on the same page about the product types and what we're talking about, let's get into more detail about the TLEDs. If you're familiar with the DLC solid state lighting or SSL program for the commercial non-horticulture lamps and luminaires, the eligibility rules for these products are really pretty similar between the two programs, between SSL and horticulture. So in horticulture, we are including 2, 4, and 8-foot replacement lamps that have a G13 base, so those T8 replacements, and just the 4-foot replacements for T5 and T5 high output lamps that have a G5 base. The basic requirements are also the same in that the bare lamp, meaning the lamp operated outside of a luminaire, but including the fluorescent ballast, if it's a type A or ballast compatible, that will need to use, to meet the V2 requirements, with some exceptions, which I'll cover in a little bit, and that is driver lifetime and warranty. But again, I'll cover these exceptions in a couple more slides. Finally, TLEDs must also have a beam angle of greater than or equal to 140 degrees. And this, again, is consistent with our solid state lighting program requirements for these types of lamps. Okay, next slide, thanks. So next up, the Mog LEDs. They are now eligible in the horticultural program as UL type B lamps, meaning only those that bypass the ballast, again with E39 or E40 bases. There is a pretty key difference between MOGLEDs in the horticulture program and the SSL program, in that there are no reference housings requirements associated with these lamps. So like TLEDs, the bare lamp operated outside of a fixture or a luminaire must meet the version 2 requirements of the Hort lighting program. And again, with the exception of driver lifetime and warranty. So I'll cover these again in the next slide, so hang on for those. There's some additional requirements for MOGLEDs. They must report the beam and field angles. They don't have a beam angle threshold like TLEDs. We're just reporting the beam and field angles and also reporting the intended mounting position for these lamps. The PPID polar plots must include the intended tested mounting position for these products. Okay, thank you. You're good at anticipating, Casey. All right, so on to these exceptions that I've been teasing about. So these two exceptions to the requirements for the larger luminaire requirements are the result of really good feedback that we got on the draft policy. So I'll echo Casey and say thank you to those of you that provided comments to us and engaged with us on these issues. This is exactly why we work through the stakeholder input processes to work through some of these finer details. So first, regarding the electronics lifetime, the feedback that we received is that for most integral driver lamps, the driver is not really a distinguishable, part of the lamp, but more that the circuitry is often integrated or interwoven into the electronics of the lamp emitting light, and therefore it's kind of not a single element to make a claim about lifetime that this single piece is the driver. It's kind of the whole unit. So after working with you all stakeholders, we created a different but related requirement for lamps, meaning so instead of meeting the driver lifetime, lamps can perform a in situ temperature measurement test, the ISTMT, at their own defined temperature measurement point on the lamp housing. And then they provide a spec sheet showing that the lamp meets the lifetime requirements of 50,000 hours based on that location's operating temperature, and also a diagram showing that temperature measurement point, the TMP. So this is, if you're familiar with the driver lifetime requirements for luminaires, this is modeled after that, and it's very similar, but tailored for lamps with this kind of, different style of electronics. Okay, the other piece of good feedback that we heard is that 5-year warranties for lamps are hard to come by in horticulture applications, knowing that this is a kind of nascent technology and we're still kind of working out lamps, but we still want to bridge the transition to LED to complete luminaires. And so we went back and looked back at the analysis and all the data we collected on lamps, and it showed us that 3 years is most common for lamp warranties. So we have revised the warranty requirement at this time for lamps from 5 years to 3 years. We may increase that in the future once the market develops a little bit for these lamps, but as far as version 2.1 is concerned, we're just going with 3 years for now for warranty. Okay. So just like the previous sections, these last few slides will cover What will be listed on the horticultural QPL for these two types of lamps? First, these lamps will be listed by product category. Linear replacement lamp is the only option for TLEDs right now. There's no U-bends, that type of thing. We're just looking at linear lamps. However, MOGLEDs have two options. They will be listed either as screw base replacements, omnidirectional, or screw base replacements, directional. And that's so we can, QPL users can distinguish whether the lamp is omnidirectional or directional. Next, the base type will be listed. So for TLEDs, we have three options: G13, G5, and FA8 for those single pin 8-foot lamps, and then E39 or E40 for the MOGLED base lamps. Product size information is important for users to make sure that when they buy a replacement lamp for their incumbent technology, they know it will fit in their luminaire, their fixture. And it's a bit different for each of the two lamps, and we wanted to be really clear on this piece. So we've included diagrams in the policy. I've included them here on the next slide as well to help document or define what dimensions are required for each. Casey, next slide, please, and we'll take a look at what that means for TLED. So we have a very basic looking linear lamp there. They must provide the nominal length in inches, and this includes the pin base as well as the diameter of the tube. So we just want to be clear that, it is nominal length, but we are talking about the pins as well. And then diameter is pretty typical, but I know LEDs can vary a little bit. So let's go on to the next slide for MOGLEDs. So this one's a little more complex. They must list the length, which is the distance from the tip of the screw base to the top of the lamp, so the full length of the lamp, along with the width and height. And I know what you're thinking, that most of these lamps, like the corn cobs, are typically round. So for lamps that are round, the width and the height will be the same, and that's okay. And we will accept that on the application, and that will let the QPL user know, okay, this is a round lamp. But we don't want to exclude or, kind of make the oversight that there are paddle style lamps or kind of hairbrush shaped that aren't round. So in the case of those lamps, and not pictured, but in the case they are listed with the width as the maximum dimension perpendicular to the screw base. So essentially it's the widest point. And that way someone will know if it is a paddle style kind of not round lamp and they have a kind of a smaller reflector, they know that that lamp can go in there, or they will know whether or not it fits. Okay, next slide. So continuing on with the rest of the QPL listing information, each lamp must report their UL type to indicate their ballast compatibility. TLEDs have a few options: type A, B, AB dual, or type C. However, as I mentioned, only type B MOGLEDs are eligible at this point, so that's the only option for them. So it will basically, that field will show up just so folks know, but that will be automatically selected for those products at this time. Both lamps must report the beam angle, but remember that TLEDs do have a minimum threshold. They must have the beam angle of greater than or equal to 140 degrees. There's no threshold on beam angle for MOGLED, so that it's just a reporting requirement there. MOGLEDs have those two additional reporting requirements as well. They must report the field angle as well as the intended mounting position. And there are three options for the intended mounting position: horizontal, vertical, and universal. Okay, so that wraps it up for the lamps and the three new technical topics. So I'm gonna take just a moment to recap everything since we covered a lot here, and then we will get into some questions and answers. Okay, this looks very similar to a slide that Casey covered earlier. So in summary, 2.1 establishes eligibility for 3 new product types in the DLC horticulture program. The DC and modular configurable systems that Greg covered, products with externally supplied active cooling capabilities that Casey covered, and what I just went through, the LED lamp products. And so if you're looking for these in the policy document, they're included down towards the end of the policy document as special considerations. All the technical requirements that still must be met for most of them are up top. And it's also important to note, and I know Casey covered this, but it's worth saying again, that luminaires that don't fall into these categories, the technical requirements don't change. They still meet those version 2 requirements. What 2.1 and is typical of what we call a minor update with a point revision. So instead of a whole number, this is just 2.1. The technical requirements don't change. We're only adding to the program and adding to the products that are eligible at this time. Okay, hope that's clear. All right, we have reached the question and answer stage, and if you give me a moment, I will be facilitating the question and answer. I'm going to take a look at the questions that you have all put into the question pane, and we will find some to answer. There's Greg, thanks. Now you can all see 3 of us matching in our plaid shirts. So give me a moment and I'm gonna reorganize my screen so I can find the question pane and get some of these going. Okay. Let's see. Can I submit a 2.1 product right now? Casey, can you help me with that one?
Yep. So today we're accepting the version 2.0 applications, but we won't be accepting 2.1 applications until the version 2.1 effectivity date, which is September 1st.
Great. That's what I'm... Okay. Greg, I think this one's for you. Are DC products with a reported cabling option required to be installed with that same cabling type or gauge?
No, that is just an example. Trying to give a demonstration for commonly used fixture and cabling arrangements, but the actual cable lengths and the gauges used are going to vary based on the facility configuration, distances, local electrical codes, all those types of things.
Okay. Awesome, thanks. Casey, another one back to you. It's doesn't seem like so much of a question, but a comment, and maybe you can speak to it, that many testing agencies are still not ready for LM79 testing for these actively cooled or water-cooled products in the goniophotometer. Have you heard that? I know you've talked to some test labs. Any thoughts there?
Yes, so this is something that I'm aware of, that we've been aware of here for a while. So there aren't many, but there are some that I have been in coordination with that do or have already tested these types of products. But yeah, they are few and far between, but there is a pathway. So rather than us being the link or the funnel that's squeezing the tube and not letting these types of products be considered in states like Illinois or Massachusetts, where there are certain compliance pathways that look to the DLC QPL, we are trying to lay out a pathway that can accommodate those product types, even though there are limited tested facilities. And that's another reason actually why we're proposing, or why we're requiring now that they test with water. This comes from feedback from the test labs that I've known that do test these types of products, saying that other types of liquids are much harder to work with, and that they prefer water just for general ease of use.
Okay, thanks. I will take one. The question is, do will you include or do you include residential style products, and meaning probably medium screw-based lamps? That is, medium screw-based lamps are not eligible at this time, but we are interested in interested to know if there is, an appetite for these, or if there's interest in these categories. What we kind of heard is that the medium screw-based lamps used in commercial grow facilities are often kind of supplemental or just photo period lamps, and so the hours of operation are not that great, and so the payback going from an incandescent or halogen lamp to LED doesn't really make sense. But like I said, we are still considering these medium screw base or other residential style products. So feel free to shoot us an email and let us know what you think, what you've seen at horticulture at designlights.org. And we will be happy to take that into consideration for the next version. Okay. Greg, why are you evaluating DC powered fixtures against the Hort QPL threshold PPE at their AC D-rated PPE rather than the DC PPE shown on their LM79 test?
Great question, Axel. So firstly, we're evaluating at the ACD rated value because AC to DC conversion losses are included in the AC horticultural product. So, using the ACD rated PPE provides the best direct comparison to the products already on the horticultural QPL. And, secondly, because the DLC member utilities who are considering the DC powered products for incentives are ultimately concerned with the product energy consumption off of the AC grid. So we recognize that some DC powered products will never be connected to the grid or AC power, but this is a primary concern for our membership.
Okay, Greg, I'm going to keep it going for you. What size DC source will be required to test DC Hort fixtures, wattage, voltage, and amps?
Great. So I'm assuming the question is referring to the power source test report. So in that test report, we're looking for benchtop testing of whatever power sources the product manufacturer is selling with their, fixtures, their product, or whatever they are marketing as the intended power source for their product. So we want to get that benchtop data on whatever they're selling or marketing. And that often comes in a couple different sizes. There might be a small, a medium, and a large, power source option, depending on how many products are being used, how big of a grow facility is being powered, from 600 watts up to, 20 kilowatts potentially. And if the question is referring at all to the photon flux testing, that, simply any DC source, AC to DC source that is big enough to power the product for an LM79 test. The actual performance of the power source in the photon flux test won't comprise any data in the LM79. That's excluded because we're simply taking the DC power input in that LM79 test. Hope that answers that question, but if not, please jump back into the chat or email us with a clarification.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to just read one that is says just a comment, so I'll just read it aloud. You should create a list of labs. As to spectrum testing, we went through UL labs and tested against UL 8800 and DLC 2.0. They have no details as to 2.1 yet, as far as we were told. Okay, noted. And I think we have been working with labs, and I think 2.1 was only recently released, and it will be effective September 1st. And so that is a time in which, until then, we can be working with labs and getting them up to speed on 2.1 and the associated requirements. So thanks for that comment. Okay, Casey, I think this one is for actively cooled, but let me know if I'm misunderstanding it. Do you require actual LM79 tests at the 5 degree Celsius steps through the operating input temperature range?
All right, you're right, that one is for me. So no, we do not require a formal LM79 test on the 5 degree increments. That can be coming from in-house or benchtop data, but we do expect that the testing that's done in-house or benchtop would correspond to LM79 requirements.
Okay. All right, I think we are getting through them, but let me take one more look. I think that's it. Does anybody see one there that I missed that we should address? Ooh, one more came. Okay. Follow up on the last question, Casey. Can it be a single relative point monitored over time and temperature, or do you need actual test data at individual temperatures?
Yeah, so we do expect that the in-house or benchtop data would come from actually testing at those temperatures. But we are not validating exactly how that is done.
Okay. All right. One more, Casey. Let's see. This one is a little technical again, but related to actively cooled. On slide 21, you mentioned, well, it's relevant to slide 21. Fail to off requirements may rely on the driver's over temperature protection. If the driver's OTP drops to 20% rather than 0%, will this still meet the DLC requirement?
Yeah, so we do require the self-protect functionality, but we do not specify, I guess, how that functionality happens. So if that self-protect functionality does rely on the driver's OTP, and that can be tied to some maximum inlet fluid temperature that could be reported on the QPL, then it should still meet our requirements.
Okay, great. Anything else that I'm missing here? And if you haven't entered your question in yet, go ahead. Otherwise, I think we're just coming up on 2 minutes till time, and we will wrap up. Okay, not hearing anything. I think this is a good time to move on. So if you have a question that we didn't get to, or you come up with a question after we sign off, we are always available at horticulture@designlights.org, and we're good at answering those email questions. So feel free to reach us there. Okay, and this is the simple thank you slide. So really, thank you very much for attending the webinar. Thank you for providing your expertise and feedback throughout the draft requirements of both version 2.0 and 2.1. This has been a longer haul, so we're really excited to start getting these products certified. So thank you again. Have a great rest of your day. Email any additional questions or comments to horticulture@designlights.org. Thanks.